Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments chosen from the books of our favourite A-lister food writers. I'm Gilly Smith, and this week I'm with Bill Buford, the former fiction editor of The New Yorker and author of Dirt, on uprooting his family and immersing them for 5 years in an epic adventure in French cooking. But before we meet Bill, a word from the hosts of another of my favourite food podcasts, The Cookbook Circle. A rare moment in podcasting rapport with fun facts and well-researched chef content. Victoria and Hannah tell us why we should listen and what they're listening to.
Hello, I'm Hannah.
And I'm Victoria.
And in our podcast, The Cookbook Circle, we review the UK's most popular cookbooks.
Each episode, we take one of the top books, read it, cook from it, and discuss all of our thoughts and feelings about the book, and have the occasional emotional breakdown over an artichoke.
Cooking the Books listeners will love us for our general food, ingredient and chef chat, things that you all love too, and a few jokes thrown in for good measure.
The Cookbook Circle podcast wouldn't exist if we hadn't bonded over our mutual love of the powerhouse that is the Off Menu podcast. So we have to shout out to Ed Gamble and James Acaster for their amazing work and constant inspiration.
Now, back to Manhattan and the home of Bill Buford, where it sounds like he's printing his next book. Through his 4 food moments, he takes us back in time, through an Odyssean journey, wife and twin toddlers in tow, to the top Lyonnese restaurants where he learnt to cook like a top French chef. He went in search of the roots of French food, and he found the heart of French culture. But why, I asked, did he choose Lyon?
I'd always assumed that I would be going to Paris. When I thought, French training, okay, I can do something maybe with a French chef in the United States by way of an introduction, but I just assumed Paris. And it was when I got one of those introductions, when I was working with a chef, Michel Richard, in Washington, D.C., and was hanging out in the evening with some of the other cooks. And they were saying, no, you don't want to go to Paris. Paris is cosmopolitan. It's all these different cuisines there. Everybody's got their cuisine there. It's not Parisian. What's Parisian? It's just generic French. You need to go someplace local. And they were talking about where they had both worked and met. These were two guys who cooked together. They're both French, and they'd cooked at a great restaurant in Burgundy, out in the countryside, and they had a relationship to the vines and the farmers and I was trying to place it, and they were saying, yeah, it's near, it's like an hour and a half from Lyon. No, it's an hour from Lyon. No, I think it's an hour. And then they both thought, Lyon is where you need to go. Lyon is absolutely the place you got to go. Lyon is the gastronomic capital of the world, as it's called. And they got so excited. It's local, and the wines are local, the food is local, they've got their own. That's where French cooking began. That's where you go. Okay.
But Lyon you describe as the gritty darkness. You say people are going to be put off by the sewage smells, the broken cobblestones, the low cloud melancholy. I have seen the view from your house, though, I have to say, and it was pretty marvellous.
It was a good view.
However, Lyon is not necessarily with its... And its food is kind of hard to access, isn't it? It's all about entrails and calf's heads and the famous andouillette. Do you want to take us through the andouillette, bearing in mind people might be listening to this over breakfast?
Oh, it's not really so bad, but it is very vivid and very immediate. It's tripe. It's tripe in a pig's intestine. It's tripe in a sausage casing, but the sausage comes from a pig's intestine, as do the insides of the andouillette itself. It's the first thing I ate when I came to Lyon. It's not quite what I expected it to be, but I like tripe, but it has figured in my life really rather it's a very dominant theme. When I went to Italy and worked in Italy, I was making tripe there and did enough tripe that I remember when I was lucky enough to have my book published in German, and I went to Germany, there were all these very enthusiastic cooks who then wanted to give me tripe. And every place I went, they gave me tripe. And then the first thing I do when I come to Lyon is I eat tripe. Of course you'd eat tripe. It's what you do. It's hearty Lyonnais basic cooking is surprisingly simple, and it includes all of the animal, and there's pride in eating all of the animal, and there's pride in knowing that you're not going to waste the animal, and there's a pleasure in finding delicacies and flavors in the extreme bits of the animal. So it's going to be It's going to be intestines. It's going to be lung. It's going to be the bladder, feet. You're rarely going to get like a delicious pork chop.
And going to a place where this is the currency is going to be an adventure. It's going to be an immersive adventure. And for somebody like you who's a writer, that's what you're looking for. You're going hardcore. This is what you're going for. Were you aware? Was that kind of the exciting adventurer writer in you, kind of looking for that difficulty, to that sort of jeopardy, the will he, won't he, to get through the book? Did you and your publisher spot that?
I knew it was going to be hard, but I knew it was going to be hard as an American who didn't speak French, going into a French kitchen and learning French techniques. And I remember looking at volumes of French skills and thinking, I don't even know what these terms mean. I can't imagine. It's difficult to project myself acquiring the knowledge where I would do these things without having to reflect on them. The whole prospect was just daunting as hell. What I hadn't really appreciated is that on top of that, going to Lyon, it's a very private, closed city with a lot of peculiar habits and a lot of grittiness. It's true. And it was pretty hard. It was, you were going into, when we were there, we didn't feel like we were in Europe. It wasn't familiar in the way that going to Paris would be familiar, or Rome or Madrid. We felt really isolated. We felt a long way from New York, a long way from our friends. Our identities were stripped in many respects, partly because we weren't supported by the immediate friends. But New York, I'd been the fiction editor of the New Yorker. I was a staff writer of the New Yorker.
You were somebody.
I was.
You were somebody.
I had a life there.
Yeah.
I was a somebody. And I went into Lyon, and I was nobody. And people didn't care about the New Yorker, and they weren't interested in writing a book. They were kind of testing us. But we didn't know that at the time. And it was a tough city to get into. It's a beautiful city, it must be said. It is gritty. You got dog poop just about everywhere. And in the summertime, it's never admitted, but in the summertime, there's a heavy pollution that comes down the Rhone Valley that settles on top of the rivers there. And it's awful, and everybody gets sick. But it is a city between two beautiful rivers. It's an ancient city, and it's got ancient architecture, and it is gorgeous and dirty.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah. And, most importantly, this was a family trip. Your saint of a wife, Jessica, was already a linguist. She'd spent some time in France, so she was able to fast-track you and the process of actually settling in France. Your boys, not so. They were 2 years old. But you did manage, thanks to the organisational skills of your wife, largely, to actually get a place and go through all the enormous logistics of actually getting the visas and getting to France. Tell us how you managed to persuade Jessica that you were going to take on this enormous adventure.
When I finally realized that Lyon was the place to go, and until that moment, my wife and I had been operating on an assumption that I'd do like a crash course with a French chef in America, and then we do a really intensive experience in the summer, probably in Paris, almost certainly in Paris, and then get back in time for the boys to start preschool, in effect. And it's a big process in New York where you have to audition, and Jessica did all the work, and it's very hard to get in. It's a competitive business. So we had children, and evidently they needed to be educated, and they needed to learn to read and things like that. But what I realized what I need to do is go to Lyon. I hatched this plan that we'd go there as a family for the summer, and then Jessica would take the boys back, and then I would work out through the autumn, and then I'll be home for Christmas. And she said, No, you're not going. And it was a big moment. And I remember saying, I'm not? And she said, no, we are. We're moving to Lyon. I thought, wow. In many ways, it was like one of the great moments of our marriage, because I was doing all this stuff to write books because I'm a writer, and that was my role, and I was carrying the family with the prospect that I would publish quickly enough to be able to support the family. And at that moment, it was no longer about me, and my whole story changed. It became the story of moving as a family to a part of France that most people don't know, and it all changed. It was actually a great moment in our marriage.
I bet. I mean, I felt very envious, actually. I love immersive experience. I always think that one day I'll go to France and I'll do something. I had no idea what I would do, because certainly I would never go and work in a French kitchen after reading Dirt. That's for sure. But, it's a hell of a thing to take everybody with you. But that is the story. You do become a chef on the line. You are dealing with all the stuff that chefs do, which is working very, very long hours. Now, they were 3-year-olds by the time you actually started working, weren't they?
It's true. There were 2-year-olds when Jessica and I had that conversation.
Yeah, 3-year-old twins at home going through all the stuff about settling into schools, and you are really not there, are you? How did that go down?
That was a challenge. I was definitely home too much when we first arrived, because we ended up arriving just before Christmas in the winter, and we couldn't find anything, and we weren't sure if the boys were going to be in school, and I couldn't find a job. But when I finally did get work, I left before the boys got up. I would sometimes come home during a break, during the pause, and have a nap, and then I'd leave, and then I wouldn't get home until everyone had gone to bed. Sometimes Jessica
It's very hard. I mean, you mentioned one time when Jessica had a migraine and she'd been throwing up all night, and you've got toddlers at home, and she was not able to be in charge of them, and you went to work late, and that was not allowed, even under those circumstances. It's a very punishing regime, and it goes very much into your second food moment, which is really dealing with reality. I mean, the French kitchen. Daniel Boulou actually said, his assistant says, the chef wants you to know that no one in America is doing what you're doing. This is hardcore.
That's
so
true.
He knew what you were going through.
That's
and,
true.
You tell the story of Dan Barber and his appalling treatment. I mean, he doesn't say which restaurant it was, but the chef says, oh, what's that smell? What's that smell? Ah, the smell of a Jew. I mean, this is pretty nasty stuff. And you did come up against this, as did your colleagues in the kitchen. Tell us about Florian, for example.
Florian was a tall, lanky, gangly, nervous 19-year-old who was part of the original team when the kitchen where I ended up, La Mère Brazier, reopened. It closed. It's a very famous kitchen that closed and then reopened. So he was part of the reopening team, and that was the team that I was joining. I don't even know how it happened, but one day Florian decided that made him nervous and that I was a problem. And I do wonder if he's getting some implicit instruction from the executive chef, but he turned on me. There's one busy night where he said, you make me too nervous. I want you to stand over there on a step. This is the step to an outside part. It's like being made to stand in the corner. But we came to a point of confrontation, and I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. And I ended up standing on the step and just feeling like a complete idiot.
Like a child.
And then he started, later as I got in the kitchen and I was doing more things, he would give me his work to do. It got worse and worse and worse. He would, whenever he saw me go, Putain! He'd sort of stick out his foot and trip me. And till
it was bullying. It was bullying, wasn't it?
It was bullying. And it was a very strange thing, because he clearly had been bullied a lot. And he was being tolerated by the executive chef because he'd been fired from positions a couple times. And it was as if he was being encouraged to be a member of the tough brigade.
Yeah, and this is what happens in kitchens. This is what happens in kitchens. You're a writer. You're not really a chef. You were kind of just there to kind of to write about this as an experience. But you were thrown into the deep end of the heart of the French kitchen culture. We know this to be a thing. Poor old Hortense, one of your other colleagues, she was the only woman you worked with in that particular kitchen. I mean, she had pans thrown at her.
That was a terrible moment, and she had a terrible moment in the kitchen. She's a good soul. The kitchen itself has changed. French kitchens have changed, and La Merbrasier has definitely changed. But she had to suffer not sexual abuse, but sexual language. And one moment, the guy she was working with, Sylvain, just flipped. I mean, I was in the main kitchen, and suddenly Hortense comes running into the kitchen from Garde Manger, and then Sylvain comes marching afterwards, just big steps, and then he just sweeps all the pots off the flat top, making such a crashing noise that I thought the ceiling had fallen in. And then he picks up the pots and he throws them at Hortense's head. Not just one, but like one after the other. Bang, 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 bang. And poor Hortense is literally hiding behind a stove. And to be fair, Sylvain wasn't really aiming them at her head. But to be fair, Hortense didn't really know that. He was not really aiming at her head. And the executive chef, he's like, his arms crossed, is watching the whole thing, and then it finishes. Somebody's asked to pick up the pots off the floor, and we go back to work. There was another occasion where there was a kid from the lycée, and at one moment, actually, I think the kid was rude to me, because the rudeness becomes contagious. So the kid was kind of imitating Florian, and then the kid was rude to me, and suddenly Sylvain picked him up by his throat and slammed him against the wall, and it pulled back his giant old fist and said, "Oh, I want to hit you in the face so bad. I don't like your face. I don't like your face." And all of us were gathered around. Nobody intervened. Again, the executive chef was there standing with his arms crossed. He'd been talking to the pastry chef, and he just paused. And I thought, oh, man, this is tough.
It's really tough.
Some of it was, you're right. I went in as a writer, but I happened to go into a restaurant which was really worried about its finances at the time, and it was reopening. It had just got 2 Michelin stars. It was under a lot of pressure. There was the summer vacances coming up, and they didn't want to have to pay a new staff member during the vacances, and so I was definitely needed. And as a writer, that's where you want to be. You don't want to. You're no longer a tourist. You're not like the journalist dipping in and out. And
you're embedded.
You're there, and so for me, it's like perfect.
Exactly. And I'm sure that plenty of people listening to this, we look at a lot of chefs listening to Cooking the Books, and some of this is how it used to be in the old days. It's really, really not like that now. But I was interested when you talked about your third food moment, which is all about the Bouchon des Filles, where the women were front of house, where they were the owners, and the guys were the ones that they were bullying. But they weren't really like that, were they? Were they just putting on a pretense, or was that real?
Oh, it was real to the extent that if their chef let them down, they would give their chef shit. It was done with a kind of wonderful sense of irony and banter and performance. The Bouchon is such a beautiful Lyonnais institution. It's very unpretentious. It's where people gather to put all the rest of their life behind them and eat simple Lyonnais cooking, and that you drink your wine in what's called a pot, spelled like pot P-O-T, but it's 500 milliliters of whatever the local wine is. It's usually a Beaujolais or a Macon. But in general, kitchens run by women are different from kitchens as they were traditionally run by men. You will get abuse. You'll be taken down. I remember I was with my family, and we stopped at a restaurant on our way to. We were going to Italy, but we stopped at a French restaurant on our way, and it was run by a woman, and she got really furious at the young cooks working for her, and she started abusing them. And we were sitting outside having a lemonade, and the boys started laughing because their French is perfect, of course, and she was calling them all toads. And it's humiliating to be called by your boss that you're an incompetent toad, but it's very different from the kind of sexual abuse that someone like Hortense in the Mère Brazier kitchen had to suffer.
It's like a mother telling her son off, rather than this real bullying, real sort of use of power. But these women, les filles, they become your friends. And this moment, this third food moment, is actually where you finally feel that you've arrived in Lyon. And again, it's the transition from impressing with food. A lot of the Lyonnais food is about kind of, a baptism of fire, getting through it to prove that you can do it as a foreigner coming in. But that moment is all about the love of eating, the real understanding of what food does for friends. And it's a nourishing, warm, heartfelt evening that makes you feel that you've really landed. Tell us about that.
It was quite a profound event. It originated with an exchange between Isabelle, one of the filles, there's Isabelle and Laura. We were eating a bouchon de fille, and she said, Bill, you are going to cook us dinner, and you're going to show us how to make pasta. And I said, oh, I am. Am I? Yes. And I said, okay. And so let's think. We can do the weekends. This Saturday, no, this Saturday we're busy. Next Saturday, we're coming for next Saturday. It was a kind of a flattering idea, but at the heart of it, really, and the numbers then grew and grew and grew, and it included husbands and partners and other chefs, and it became a little, not grand chefs, but like the real working chefs in Lyon. At the heart of the invitation, which I didn't understand until later, is that it's a very, very important threshold to cross, which is the threshold of inviting people into your home to feed them. And we all do it. And it was one of the things I liked about Britain was that there's, people have people over for dinner and they reciprocate and all that. And they do it much more than they do here in New York. But there it's kind of profound. And you make an effort. It doesn't have to be grand, but, it involves some days of cooking and preparation. And you host the table, the setting, the wine, several courses. And it is bonding in a way that I never, ever expected it to be. It's not like just having someone over for dinner. It's, you've brought us into your life. You're sharing your life. You're sharing the intimacies of your surrounding. You're feeding us. And there's a Lyonnais assumption that magical things happen at the table, that all problems are solved at the table, and that actually the time you spend at the table is the best part of your day on any day. And we did that, and they drank more than we've ever seen any Lyonnais drink, because they're generally pretty modest drinkers. And I was late. It was like 2, 3, maybe it was 3 in the morning when I finally pushed them out the door and said, we have to go to bed. And then they invited us over, and that whenever we go to Lyon, they will always have us over. They will always cook for us. And if we don't go to Lyon one summer, which happened right before COVID, they're cross. They're like, what happened? Why weren't you in touch with us? And then when we're there, we have like these 6-hour lunches.
I mean, it feels lovely. It's a lovely, lovely story of people really bonding and really getting together and really understanding what the place of food in Lyonnais society. But all the way through the book, there are these tests. There's the test of the professional kitchen. There's the test of the friendship. There's the test of the moving from foreigner to local. It feels like an endurance test some of the time. Did you feel that?
I felt there was an endurance test when I was in the kitchen, because that was actually just physically very testing. Just the hours were very testing. I think what happened in the end, after we'd been there about a year, there was a moment when we thought, wow, this is exactly where we want to be. And we felt like we were part of Lyon. The Lyonnais recognized that we got the city. They didn't regard us as tourists, foreigners, strangers, or Parisians, which would be the worst. And we got very we became very involved in that place, and we liked it. We liked being there.
Bob has a lot to do with you loving being in Lyon. And your next food moment is about Bob. It's about this smelly, dirty, socialist genius bread maker, you say, who believed that everyone should taste his bread, whose bread is ultimately the reason you called the book Dirt. Do you want to explain that?
Bob's bread was famous in Lyon. And on Saturdays and Sundays, there would be really, really long lines. His bread was a treat, and people would leave with armfuls of his bread. It was what people did instead of brunch or something like that. The bread, it wasn't obviously amazing. It was more like you were eating it and you thought, oh, well, this is actually pretty good. Or you'd finish eating it and you'd realize, it doesn't feel heavy on my stomach. Or there'd be certain aromas that arose out of it. Frederick in particular had a habit of, my son Frederick, of breaking the bread and sticking his nose right into what I think it's called the crumb, because it was like a fruity aromas arising out of what was actually good flour, which came from good wheat. Bob was the first place I found any kind of employment or a stage when I was having a hard time getting into a restaurant, and he took me on, and I was taken on the assumption that I would learn what made Bob's bread so good. And he does all the technical stuff, and he does, slow, long risings, and he doesn't rush anything, and everything takes, it's sort of 18 hours to complete. But what made his bread good was that he got good, small farmed flour with a place that had volcanic soil even, so that it had deep flavors that produced a great
iron
wheat.
Rich as well, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It was iron rich volcanic soil, which makes a huge difference to the taste.
That, and the fact that he basically is milled to order. So he'd get it every couple weeks. The moment it's milled, it's going to starch. And you want to get it as fresh as you can. But the heart of it was I took a ride once through what's called the breadbasket of France, which is that area up between the Lyon and Paris. It's big, massive acres and acres and acres and acres of mass-produced wheat, from the mass-produced flour, which is probably at the heart of the French baguette and everything else that they eat in France. And then but Bob's is coming from like a place on a sort of rocky side of the mountain, and the instead of a label, he had, or anything about the farmer, he had the picture of the farmer's goat, and that was in his window, and it was like that said it all. This is a place where the farmer has goats, and it's a small farm. I mean, it's still pretty big.
It's real.
I mean, but it's still
it's
pretty
real.
small.
But tell us about the dirt. I mean, this is the name of the book. When you do talk about that wheat from the old volcanic iron-rich soil, you're talking about stuff that hasn't been, well, it's pesticide-free. It's not organic because it's just never had pesticides. It's real. It's the way things were. It's as old as it comes. But why dirt?
One of the things I was trying to do in my time in France was learn the true taste of French ingredients and French food, the goût. And that was a thing you could only experience there, and I wanted it to become my measure of how to judge French preparations and other foods as a result. And the more I pursued that, the more interesting and local it got. There's a whole thing about the French and their cheese. It's the cliche about the French is they have their cheese. But I think the figure is something like 2,500 unique cheese preparations are recognized by the European Union, which is to say these are cheeses which come from one place and one place only, and have been made in a traditional way for a very long time, so that they have they are from that place and no other. And I think that's wonderful. And what it is that here's a practice that goes back to, centuries and centuries. And these cheeses, what they're really doing is they're saying, this is what milk tastes like when it comes from our particular patch of earth, our particular climate, our particular cows, the cows we've learned to raise in this particular place, and the practices of making cheese from it that have been passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation.
Terroir. It's the story.
I went and spent some time with a cheesemaker in the Buford in the mountains in the Alps, where in the summertime, the animals in a big pilgrimage to the high Alps will eat the summer grasses that grow as winter recedes and you get the full force of the sun, because that grass has an intensity and a flavor that goes into a milk that has a uniqueness that you can't get anywhere else, that produces a cheese, which is one of my favorite cheeses in the world, which is the Beaufortin, the summer Beaufort cheese. And that's not so different from what Bob does. Bob's, finding a wheat that's a living plant that has a flour that's made from it with a freshness that retains its life, that then is expressed in the bread, just way this cheese is. And the cheese is interesting in another respect. There's something I learned later, which is that you think, well, this is a peasant practice to bring the animals up to the top of the mountains, and it goes back to the first cultivation. But when I was in Canada, in the mountains in Canada, and I heard the people there talking about how as the spring comes, all the animals come down into the village. But then as you go into the summer, all the animals on their own go up to the top of the mountains. And in fact, this pilgrimage for the best grass doesn't come from peasants. It comes from the animals. And the moment you realize that, somehow you're involved in the flavor. The story of a particular flavor is involved in a process that's as old as the earth, as old as life. And what I liked about the French, and the French are lunatics, but what I liked about them is that they prized these special spaces, this dirt, that would produce these unique flavors that you can't get anywhere else, not only in the world, but you can't get anywhere else in another part of France.
It's a paradox in that the dirt is the cleanest of the soil. It doesn't have any pesticides. It only has the story of the people who farm it and the animals who tread the land. And it is anti-industrial. It's old school. It kind of is a metaphor for how we lost our way. And your final food moment is really about why. It's about food purity, isn't it? And that's what you found. This was the result of your mission.
True. Bob dies, and our little our quartier goes into deep mourning. He dies unexpectedly and quite tragically. And I was haunted by the idea that I never went to the farm that grew the wheat that made Bob's flour. After we left Lyon, I went back because there were a couple of things that I still wanted to do. I wanted to go out with this fisherman and learn his thing. And I stayed at a restaurant with rooms. There was nobody there. And I was having breakfast with this guy. He was wonderfully belligerent and very suspicious, even more suspicious of me than the Lyonnais had ever been. He was Savoie, and he resents the Lyonnais. And at one point he said, "You're French. It's very Lyonnais." And I thought, oh, that's very flattering for me, saying my French is so advanced that you can tell where it comes from. I said, "Thank you." And then he said, "I hate the Lyonnais." But I was there. I was the only one there. Got up early because I was going to go see the fisherman, and his arms were crossed. All French chefs seem to cross their arms, leaning against the door, watching me eat. He wasn't really having conversation; he was just watching me eat, so that he could tell me how good each ingredient was. And then I ate his bread, and I thought, "Oh wow, this is pretty good." And then we carried on talking, and then he said how Americans, when they come here, they don't respect his bread because it's been sliced. And I have to admit, I don't really like sliced bread myself. And And then the next morning, I came back again, and I had another meal, and he stood there with his arms crossed looking at me, and I thought, wow, this bread really is good. And in fact, this bread reminds me of Bob's bread. And I started asking him about where he gets his flour, and he got really defensive and arrogant and said, no, it's all local. Everything's local. It's milled. It's local. And I said, what, it's milled local? Yes, it's milled local. Over there. I said, really? There's a mill near here? And I found it, and I went there, and I met the owner, and he turns out to be a miller who specializes in small farms. And it was like, this explains Bob. It's true. And I picked up a loaf when I went back, flying back to New York. I picked it up in the morning, fed it the bread to my children when I got home, and they got all excited. And Frederick opened the bread up and stuck his nose in it, and he said, "Oh, it's like Bob's." And we finished the loaf. I came back with a 5-kilo bag or 10-kilo bag, and I made his bread with this wheat until I ran out of flour, and then I haven't really made bread since.
Oh. It's a wonderful story. It feels like you found your way to the heart of Lyon through Bob, and after his death, which is absolutely left me in tears, you find then where it all comes from. How wonderful. Legacy of Bob. So what next? I've been watching your YouTubes with the boys, who are now what?
They are 15 and they'll be 16 in September.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they are director and cameraman. It's Buford and Sons on YouTube, and it is basically Adventures in French Cooking. You're going back through some of the dishes that you were making there, and your boys are fantastically condescending to you about how to do it properly, because they are That's immersed in their Frenchness. You never quite became as French as they did, clearly. Is that fun?
It's very fun. And they do abuse me roundly and without any inhibition. These are videos of French food preparations, and I write a New Yorker piece that goes with them.
And it's on the New Yorker site.
It's on the New Yorker site, yeah. The next one we're going to do is on French fries. The last one we did was œuf à mourette, which is eggs poached in red wine. So, I mean, invariably, I'm going to use a French word because we're making French food preparations, and I know whenever I use a French word, they're going to go,
It's great fun. They settled, obviously. They cried when they came back from their first day back in New York because of the food in the canteen. How heartbroken were you to know that you had taken them the very essence of their Frenchness away from them?
We were all heartbroken to come back. It's good we came back, probably. Partly because I couldn't write a book about our being in Lyon. I discovered while I was in Lyon, because every day I opened the door, there was more things I wanted to know, and so I'm over-researched. And it's good because the boys are American, and they're grateful to be American. And they came here, and the timing worked out pretty well in all respects. We went when they were 3, and they could learn the language without too many difficulties or too many problems. And then they came back at a point where they'd spoken the language just long enough where they could retain the language, but where they could then learn to write and speak in English. But they're happy. They're happy here, but they have this French side. And they have a respect for dinner.
Have they still retained that essence of what food means?
They come to the table in the confidence that food has been made for them and has been prepared for them, and that everybody will assess it and everybody will pay attention to it, and that there is an ancillary benefit, but an essential feature, which is that while we're all gathered over this food, things happen. And they bring stories. They save stories. Things will happen during the day. Say, oh, no, I'm going to tell you at dinner. And as a result, the dinner table is a very animating, happy place. COVID has probably helped this because, basically, none of us has had a social life for 15 months. And we'd already had the dinner tradition. And it's become a very tender place where we enjoy being together.
Thanks for listening. You can buy all the books featured on Cooking the Books by clicking on the bookshop tab at gillysmith.com. And while you're there, do sign up for the newsletter to keep up with all my news. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. And I'll see you next week when we're off to Sicily with chef and food writer Ben Tish.